In the spirit of reconciliation, Limelight Arts Travel acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea, and community. We pay our respect to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. Well, welcome everyone. And in this session of Talking Tours, we're talking to Dr. Kathleen Olive about a tour that she's designed through the Apennines in parts of southern and central Italy. So this is a part of Italy that's much less well known to travellers. It's much less visited by even within Italy, but by foreigners in particular. And yet it offers an extraordinary insight into Italy's long history and its culture. So thank you very much, Kathleen, for being available today.
You're welcome, Nick.
So firstly, perhaps we could start with where in Italy this tour is focused, where it goes, and why did we decide it would be a good idea to lead groups to a much, much less visited area?
So thanks, Nick. So this tour along the Apennines focuses mostly on two regions of Italy. It focuses on a mountainous part of Italy that's kind of to the east of Rome called the Abruzzo. It goes all the way from the foothills of the mountains that you can see from Rome. If you go somewhere like Tivoli, it stretches all the way from there over to the Adriatic coast. So it's quite a big and diverse region. And then the other major part of the tour is spent in a region called Umbria, which people might be a bit more familiar with. And that's just north of the region that Rome is in and just south of the region of Tuscany. So that's the two main regions that the tour focuses on. But we have a little foray into a third region, which is the region of Lazio, of which Rome is the capital. And that allows us to pick up some sites associated with the Etruscans. But the bulk focus of the tour is really on Abruzzo and Umbria. We picked those two. I mean, this tour in a way is kind of a foundational tour for the company because when we started Limelight Arts Travel, this was one of the first tours that you and I sat down with our colleague Robert Veal and designed essentially from scratch. And the late Robert Veal undertook as well the inspection trip for this tour. And I still remember his very enthusiastic daily WhatsApp messages that he sent with videos and pictures from the time that he spent in Abruzzo in particular. And we all felt quite strongly committed to this tour as a kind of a foundational tour because it represented the things that we wanted to do as a company, which is showing a destination that people think they know really well, showing them a new side of that, a new perspective of that, taking them to a part of it that's much less familiar, that doesn't suffer from over tourism, that doesn't suffer from almost the tyranny of closeness, you know, something that you feel you know so well you don't need to see it at all. And we had, I still remember quite clearly, you and I went and even met with the Italian tourism representative in Australia to talk with him about his perspective on those destinations. Did he think that Abruzzo was ready for the kind of tour that we wanted to create? And so I still feel quite proud of it as truly an off the beaten track destination. It's not an exaggeration to say that you can travel in Abruzzo in particular without encountering any other international visitors in the entire time you're there. And I still also feel quite proud of it's a very overused word in tourism and travel, but I do really feel that this is a very authentic view on Italy that is in some ways harder and harder to gain if you go to the big cities.
And it's that I suppose when you're kind of properly off the regular tourist route, there are lots of things that might be different. So we know, for example, there are very, very few hotels of a certain standard in the region because there just aren't the travellers there for the region to really need much in the way of hotels. And you're not you're not stuck on freeways for hours, or you're not kind of dealing with huge amounts of traffic. But beyond those sort of things, in your experience, what do people respond to most when they do visit Abruzzo?
I would say that just as a preamble, the Abruzzo section of this tour, which is the lion's share of the tour, more time is spent in Abruzzo than in Umbria. And as I said, Lazio is just like a toe dip to be able to see some amazing Etruscan sites in particular. So Abruzzo is in some ways the meat of this tour, complemented by the time that's spent in Umbria. And it's certainly the part of the tour that people come away with some of the strongest impressions from. The Apennines is the kind of long mountain chain that runs essentially the entire length of the Italian peninsula, and the highest point in that chain, that entire chain of mountains, it's a bit like Italy's Great Dividing Range, and the highest point in it is Gran Sasso, a mountain peak in Abruzzo, visible from places like L'Aquila, the administrative capital of. Actually, I don't think L'Aquila. I have to correct myself there. I don't think L'Aquila is the administrative capital. But in nevertheless, the major city of the Abruzzo region, L'Aquila, you see this extraordinary mountain peak, Gran Sasso, literally big rock. What else? What else would you call the highest mountain in the Apennine chain? But big rock, and it is this almost. It's like the Paramount Pictures logo of a mountain peak. It's your mental picture of what a grand, proud. Mountain peak should look like, always snow covered, extraordinary changeable conditions. But one of the whole reasons for the historic prominence of this area, because the Apennines, like as I'm sure you experience on your tour that goes to the Dolomites, we have in our head often as I think it's especially as Australians, and I speak for myself as a Sydney-based Australian who grew up in the Blue Mountains, we see from a European's perspective mountains as something that cuts people off and makes parts of a country remote or isolated, and that obviously that can be true. But the flip side of that is also true, which is if you find the way through the mountains, if you find the river valleys, and in the case of the Apennines, if you find the high mountain pastures, you can, and people did, drive sheep from, north, almost the point of Bologna, all the way down to Puglia and the Great Plains of southern Italy. So Gran Sasso is this extraordinary mountain peak, but then the rest of Abruzzo, you'll be on this grand mountain, but then you've got the largest, longest mountain pasture in all of Italy as well. So the landscape is an extraordinary thing. This tour that we run, we don't focus on the coastal side of Abruzzo because we did want to tell the story of the mountains rather than the sea. But Abruzzo is the region that gives birth to the Italian saying mare e monti, which is the Italian equivalent of surf and turf. So you get this variation of landscape from proud mountains to, turquoise blue coastline. So the scenery is something that blows people away on this tour. But I think the thing that really blows people away on this tour is that extraordinary breadth of culture that has accumulated in pockets of Italy that as soon as you leave Rome, Florence, or Venice is just there kind of waiting with proud locals wanting to explain it all to you and tell you all about it, but you really had no idea that that was there waiting for you. So I think it's the unexpected treasures of the region that particularly stay with people after this tour.
So we've mentioned that suggesting there's a whole range of sites across quite a long period of time. And you've talked about, I suppose, the transhumance route and kind of that migration of people driving the sheep down to the south to connect them to the main Mediterranean ports. Are there any particular highlight sites that you would think would that are kind of should be on people's unmissable list?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, I would never have thought of myself as someone who would become so fascinated by sheep and stock routes. But when you're in Abruzzo, it's quite hard not to get caught up in the excitement. And when you happen to see our tour takes place as far into spring as we can get before it's hiking season, but late enough in spring that there's not snow. So we shouldn't see too many shepherds driving sheep at that time of year, but occasionally you see a late shepherd, someone who's late taking his sheep down south to Puglia, and so it's so exciting to see a shepherd driving a flock of sheep. I would never have expected of myself that that would be something that would get me going on tour, but it certainly does. So the transhuman side of things is really interesting, and it's a story that spreads through that tour. It's one of the ways in which Abruzzo is included on a UNESCO World Heritage listing because those routes that people have used to move livestock and the obviously kind of commercial structures and developments and economy that followed that is now something that's recognized by UNESCO in various countries throughout Europe, and the Abruzzo is Italy's contribution to that listing. So yeah, I do love the sheep, but I think the thing that's unmissable is basically everywhere you travel in Italy where there is a site entirely covered on the inside with frescoes top to bottom. It is known as the Sistine Chapel of whatever that region is. So if you travel off the beaten track in Italy, you're destined to visit somewhere from the Middle Ages that you're told is that place's Sistine Chapel. And the Sistine Chapel of the Abruzzo is a place called the Oratory of San Pellegrino, just like the water. And Pellegrino is pilgrim, so it's not even his name. It's just this poor holy guy who died on the side of the sheep road in the Abruzzo and was beatified by local people, and then the church kind of caught up, and now he is St. Pilgrim. There's a little oratory, tiny little oratory from the 12th century that is covered inside with 13th century frescoes. Every single part of the wall from the ceiling to the, you know, baseboard is covered in medieval frescoes of a quality because it's in the middle of nowhere. It didn't get updated. No one felt the need to destroy it later when tastes or doctrine changed. So it is perfectly preserved 13th century site in the middle of nowhere. Still one of those places where you pray for 1 bar of mobile phone reception because you have to call the guardian to come with a key in his little beat up Fiat Panda to open the thing up to let the group in. So to me, the Oratory of San Pellegrino, the so-called Sistine Chapel of the Abruzzo, that to me is a must miss, must not to be missed site. Don't, I'll tell everyone else to miss it because I would prefer it stayed off the beaten path of tourism. But as far as our tour is concerned, for me, that's just an amazing place. I mean, there's literally 1 bar in that town. You can get a coffee in one place while you wait for the custodian. I think there's 4 houses. It's literally just a halt on the road. It's not even a village. And it has this extraordinary, and the range of colors of pigments used inside are amazing. So it really challenges some of your perceptions about the Middle Ages and that great art needed to happen in big centers with access. It challenges your perceptions about that. You realize that the great artists of the Middle Ages were itinerant and that they took their art and their aesthetic toolkit, but also their actual their actual supplies they had with them and took them as they moved from place to place. And that could mean that you don't have to be in Florence or Perugia or Rome to get these extraordinary chromatic range of, yeah, lapis lazuli or malachite or these amazing colors. You can get them in the middle of nowhere in the mountains as well. So that's my not to be missed side.
Okay, well, so it sounds like it's definitely worthwhile, but it's also one that it strikes on a theme that runs throughout the tour in different respects.
Yeah, not cheap.
No, not sheep. There's more to the region than sheep. Um, there's and was thinking as well. There's also I think we were talking about it before. We mentioned that although it's not something we tend to think of as being the most obvious theme, but there are important aspects of late antique and medieval spirituality and how those change from the late Roman world into the medieval world that run through this part of Italy in particular.
Yeah, I think this is always the challenge to us when we're designing cultural tours is that there has to be enough on an itinerary that people know about and recognize that gets them thinking, yeah, I'd really like to go to that place. But then there are the sleeper hits that people are absolutely going to love or find very, very interesting, but we could never sell a tour based on those. So I hesitate to say this. First of all, I'm never going to sell a tour on the basis of sheep. And I also feel like I'm never going to sell a tour if I use the words medieval spirituality, but I would say that the one of the leitmotifs of this tour is that you really do get a sense of how Christianity arrived in Italy as this fringe kind of thing. Sure, the Roman emperors had legitimated it in the fourth century. You were no longer, well, with some exceptions, you weren't going to be killed for being a Christian anymore, but it really becomes a kind of high state language of power, and it's easy to not understand or to not know how popular faith in Christianity grows in Italy. And so in Abruzzo and Umbria, you visit these remote mountain hermitages where, first of all, monks from Syria fleeing persecution arrived really early in Christianity's history. You'll know the dates here better than I do, but we're talking like 5th and 6th century persecuted Syrian monks who bring Christianity to, well, particularly bring Christianity to Italy, but they don't want to live in places where they can easily disseminate their faith. They want to be in the middle of nowhere, living as difficult a life as possible because they're hermits. That's what they're used to. So you get these amazing kind of rock cut churches and hermitages from really early periods. And then in the 13th century, and with this tour, people are more familiar with this idea for Assisi in Umbria and St. Francis, which of course is a site we visit on the tour. But he's not the only one. You get this extraordinary explosion of spirituality in Italy in the 13th century where people are finding all of these different ways to live out their faith in experiential and practical and meaningful ways. And that runs a whole gamut from, Francis of Assisi choosing voluntarily to live amongst communities of lepers and minister to them, which is what we think about when we're in Assisi, to some quite unusual, strange 13th century women who, refuse to marry, refuse to eat, wall themselves up in, one room and, commune only with God from that point on, which is another feature of medieval spirituality in Umbria. And then in Abruzzo, you get this extraordinary figure who no one had ever really heard of until Benedict the 16th stepped back from the papacy more recently. And that's the only other pope before him who had ever stepped back from the papacy. That's Celestine V, who was a 13th century hermit monk from Abruzzo who is put forward as a kind of a compromise candidate when the papal seat becomes vacant and has no desire to be pope, but is kind of diplomatically retrofitted into being Pope. And I can't remember how many months he manages to hold on for, but he's very reluctantly Pope for a very short period of time before he retreats back to these mountain hermitages that he'd founded in Abruzzo. And we visit a number of them on the tour. And, one of them is on the top of it's a mountain chain, a massif called the Maiella, which for the people of the Abruzzo is like their regional identity is all on top of that massif, basically. And he founded a number of hermitages up there, and we visit a few of them. But one of them is just still one of those places abandoned now, but still one of those places that you go to. You can see with your own eyes the transformation from just 3 or 4 men living in caves to try and isolate their Christian practice from the influence of the world to a whole community of people having to grow their own food and do their own study despite not having, easy roads to get in and out. And so to me, the sleeper hit of the tour, which is not sexy enough to market the tour on the basis of, is medieval spirituality and the theme that tracks through the tour, arguably right to the end of the tour when we visit some extraordinary gardens of very important church prelates close to the Umbrian town of Orvieto, where the final base of the tour is. We visit some extraordinary Renaissance gardens that kind of, for me, represent the terminus of medieval spirituality, and its culmination in just a language of wealth and power.
And that's quite a shift from Celestine V renouncing the papacy and the wonderful contemporary story about that doesn't necessarily reflect reality, where somebody who wanted to be the next pope drilled a hole on a pipe through the wall he was sleeping into and pretended to be an angel telling him it was time to renounce the papacy, and then going through to that kind of those extraordinary late Renaissance and gardens. Of those gardens, because again, it's part of Italy where again, it's not, I don't know, it's not like having to drive from Sydney to Burke or anything like that, but it's a region that still feels much less traversed by people. Is there
It,
kind of
yeah.
is there a reason why you
I
think
do
it?
think I mean, I think there are lots of reasons, but I think you've hit on something with the roads because anyone who's driven outside of Rome in Lazio, the region that kind of lies adjacent to Orvieto. I always think of Orvieto as being part of the administrative region that Rome is in, but it isn't. It's actually part of Umbria. It's right on the edge of Umbria, where Umbria becomes Lazio. So it's a kind of a cheat space for us to get into Lazio and see these gardens and also see the Etruscan sites. And anyone who's driven roads outside of Rome will understand that all of the funding for roads goes to the city of Rome and is not shared around the regions because the fastest way to get from A to B is never the best way to get from A to B. You have to take all of these secondary roads, no white roads as the Italians call them. They're all paved roads, but they're single lane regional roads. And you'll think to yourself, didn't we drive past that exact same villa 20 minutes ago? So it's I do think roads are part of it. It's quite hard to get around to those sites on that edge of Umbria without wheels. It's quite hard to do it independently. So I think that's part of the reason. I think the other part of the reason is that when we tell the story of Italian history and Italian art and Italian culture, we tend to look at big centers and the regions always get left off. And that's not, just an Italian story. That's often how we tell the history of lots of different countries and regions. So I think, if you think about the grand tours in the 18th century, no grand tourer was saying, you simply must go to this mountain hermitage in the Abruzzo and see these 13th century frescoes. So I think some of these sites have been left off what we think of as the must visit, must see places in Italy. And it's functionally hard to get to them. But I think the other thing that makes it harder to visit places like the Etruscan sites and to a lesser extent, but still somewhat, also those Renaissance gardens that you mentioned, is that they are places where more perspective is helpful for appreciating what you see. So the gardens, I can admire a box hedge with the best of them, but I need to have a little bit more information about the box hedge, the circumstances in which it came to be, and why this box hedge is particularly important. You do need a backstory, and the Etruscans, I think, require a significant backstory. It's we are fascinated by them. We have all of these ideas about the Etruscans, like we don't know their writing system, we can't read their language, all of these ideas that are actually not true. We do have their writing, we can read their writing. We have the Rosetta Stone for the Etruscan culture that exists. We have an extraordinary amount of material culture. We have a huge amount of documentation by others, for example, the Rising Romans, about the Etruscans and how they lived. We do know that, yeah, women enjoyed a really privileged position within Etruscan society. We do know how the great and the good lived. We know what their religious systems were. We've got their temples. We've got their tombs. We've got all their grave goods. But we just have this idea that they're this mysterious people swallowed up by the civilization of Rome, and so we feel like we need a lot of unpacking for those sites. So I think an expert perspective, which so certainly for the Etruscan visits, we work with a local guide who specializes in Etruscan culture, and if you asked her, was she an Italian? She would say yes. If you asked her, was she from Lazio? She'd probably prefer to describe herself as an Etruscan, I think. She's a self-identified Etruscan. And the Renaissance gardens that we visit, we don't visit them all. There's, any cardinal worth his salt built a garden in the area north or south of Rome in the 16th century for historical reasons. We can talk about if we want to, but we can't visit all of those, obviously. So the ones that we do visit, we've obviously carefully chosen to tell particular sides of a story, and you could try and get to them yourself. People do, but to have them put together for you, shaped into a coherent kind of way of thinking about this phenomenon of garden building in the 16th century in the upper echelons of the church. I think obviously it enriches your appreciation of the sites.
Definitely. And are there any in particular that you enjoy taking people to?
I love two in particular, so unsurprisingly, they're both on the itinerary because I think one of the great rules of tour leading is that you should be able to put something on the itinerary that you want to go to, and your job as tour leader is to convince everyone else that they were happy to go to those places with you. So the two gardens that I would always put on an itinerary are two 16th century gardens that are at the kind of opposite ends of the spectrum of this grand um, garden building, villa building phenomenon of the 16th century. And one of those is Villa Lante, beautiful, structured, geometric Italian garden built by a cardinal. It has a very complex ownership history, but built by a cardinal in the middle of the 16th century, designed by this key figure in the world of garden design, together with an up and coming architectural designer, these two really important names. And it's everything you think of when you think of a classical Italian garden. It makes use of a terrible sloping site. It uses structure in the parterre. It's almost perfectly symmetrical. It has extraordinary water games that delight, but also punished unsuspecting visitors, hidden jets of water, all of that kind of thing that you want in a cardinal's garden, I guess, when you're using it as a site for entertaining, which was its purpose. And it has been an enormously influential garden in subsequent garden design. So, for example, someone like Cecil Pinsent, or even to a certain extent, the gardens of Versailles, the work of Lenotre, you can't really not think about this garden at Villalante when you see the later gardens that you think, oh my goodness, that rill of water and how it comes down the hill is exactly taken from Villalante. I still, I'll visit people's backyard gardens and think to myself, oh, that's exactly the parterre arrangement of Villalante. Do you even know that kind of thing? So that's the kind of exactly the formal Italian Renaissance garden that you think of.
So it's
And
a kind of an garden
an
for,
garden,
yeah,
exactly,
yeah.
in so many ways. But then the flip side of that, designed, we believe, by the exact same person, which I think to me is one of the things I love about it, is this wild, rangy, pagan, not even a garden, it's a sculpture park. It's a 16th century sculpture park, and that's known as the Sacro Bosco, or the Sacred Wood of Bomarzo. People probably know it from the Monty Don Italian Garden series, where it has that big ogre's mouth that is carved out of. I mean, that's the thing about the Sacred Wood. They're sculptures, but they're sculptures carved in situ. It's tufa or volcanic rock in this area, and it can be carved out without too much effort, although let's not talk about the laborers. But the sculptures are actually carved out of the very rock where you see them. It's not like they're poised on top of the rock. They are monolithic. They're one with the rock base, and everything has been removed from around them. And it is a mystical garden. And there is, again, you visit it and you think, this is a mystical thing that I can't understand. But we have the key. We know from the 16th century how it was designed and how to interpret it. We know we can unpick the story that it's telling about this mystical pagan spiritual journey of the soul after death. It's essentially a mourning husband's set piece for his deceased wife. And I just love that it's the exact opposite of Villalante, but probably designed by the same person in the same bracket of about 5 or 10 years. So those to me are, I love that day because you start actually with the wildness and the ranginess of the Sacro Bosco because it's better in the morning from a point of view of weather. And that also means that you can sometimes get mist, and mist in that garden is just like, the cherry on top of the sundae. But then in the afternoon, you go to Villalante because the shadows on a parterre garden are always better at a lower kind of raking light. So you try and get there when the shadows are at their best at Villalante. And then you think, oh, this is kind of the other flip side of that same coin. People who were highly intelligent and highly structured, but who also, on the flip side, wanted spaces where they could just let their imagination run wild, and it's all about entertaining guests, but in different ways. The guest gets to walk through the garden, but they've also got to do a lot of thinking in order to get the joke of the garden, which, the Renaissance patrons loved a good inside joke.
Mm. Kind of one of the things just listening to you talk about these places and the range of places that I'm reminded of that with a tour like this that's exploring a much less visited region, you've got this accretion of history, this a great range of sites, all that need contextualizing. So I think it's kind of one of those difficult things to be across so many aspects of Italy's history and not just a specialist in one. You mentioned that kind of for some sites, like with the Etruscans, we work with a specialist guide. Are there other places on this tour where you would want to draw on a kind of a localized knowledge? Or is there kind of this?
Oh no, absolutely, the whole way through. And sometimes it's structured and sometimes it just happens. So in terms of the structure, we work in Orvieto with a local archaeologist who literally has the key to Etruscan archaeological sites and Roman archaeological sites located underneath the everyday buildings of Orvieto, that if you were walking down that street, you would not know that there was an Etruscan temple underneath that building, but there is, and he has the key. And not only does he have the key, he excavated that site as well. He's a guy about, I was going to call him a young man, but then I thought, wait, he's about my age. So let's not specify whether he's young, middle-aged or not. Let's just say he's about my age. And he excavated those sites. And, he's an archaeologist from a regional place, so his accent when he speaks English is not as perfect as you might hope, but it's a place where he worked and feels passionate about, and you want to hear from him, not from me reading from a book. And also in L'Aquila, we work with a local guide in L'Aquila because while I could bone up on L'Aquila and do a perfectly acceptable walking tour of L'Aquila, and there's no other guides and no other international tourists, so I wouldn't encounter any, problems with proprietary or local guides. But, L'Aquila is a place that was so, as I'm sure people know, so affected by the 2009 earthquake, and the people who have stayed and are contributing to rebuilding that city, you want to hear from them. So our local guide there is a young woman who is an art historian. She specialized on the medieval art of Abruzzo. And again, yeah, her English accent is not flawless. She grew up in L'Aquila. What opportunity has she had to get a native English accent? But to listen to her talk about how the people experienced the earthquake and how the town has tried so many different things to kind of come back from that devastating event. You need to hear that from a local. And then, as I said, there are places where it just happens. So the last time we ran this tour, there's a beautiful town called Pesco Costanzo. It's so pretty. It's one of Italy's official most beautiful towns. And it had, for reasons I won't go into, in the 16th century, there was this extraordinary local flowering in stone and wood sculpture. So quite rustic, rough materials, not marble, but limestone, and not oil paintings, but wooden carved sculptures. So we go to this village to see those sites, and we were there, and I don't know, gesturing wildly at something, and this older gentleman, it was a Sunday, walked over out of, separated himself off from this group of the old guys who, by contract must gather in Italian squares, any Mediterranean square at all, I guess, and comment on what's happening around them. And he said, "Oh, are you interested in our town?" And we said, "Yes." And he said, "Well, I'm the retired tourism commissioner for this town." And he took us on an impromptu tour of the town. I mean, it did reach a point where we wondered if we would ever be able to leave town because he was so enthusiastic about every piece of wood and every stone in the village. But that was entirely impromptu. And yeah, the person you want to hear about in that kind of a place, yeah, you could hear from me, but wouldn't it be better to have someone translate the words of the local tourism commissioner who's been trying to bring people like you to this village for the last 30 years, and now here you are. So that was a really fun experience.
And it sounds like there's a lot of potential for spontaneity, or kind of a lot of potential for the unexpected rather than spontaneity.
Yeah, I think the thing about traveling in Abruzzo in particular, and I mean, I guess I would say this about traveling in any mountainous region and in any country area as well, is that you've got to have more patience than if you're traveling in Rome, Florence, or Venice. You know, the opening hours will say one thing and the real opening hours are something else. And yeah, that amazing Sistine Chapel of the Abruzzo, your visit is booked. They know we're coming, but you still have to arrive and ring the guide because the guide doesn't know how long it will take you. You know, maybe it's going to snow, or maybe there's, you know, you're going to have to take a different road and it's going to take you a bit longer. So, definitely, I would say an ability to cope with the unexpected is a prerequisite for going off the beaten track in this kind of a way. That the weather can be, especially up on the mountains, the weather can change quite quickly. And so you've got to be quite adaptable. The first time we ran this tour, we tried 2 days in a row to get up Gran Sasso, but we couldn't because of the weather. And so we had an impromptu visit to the largest, as it turned out, largest limestone cave system in Italy, which who knew was in the Abruzzo. So yeah, I think a willingness to cope with the unexpected in order to get the flip side benefits of that is something that one needs to have in one's toolkit for this
Yes,
kind
yeah.
of a tour.
And just thinking of some of those uh, other surprises you get along the way, like some of the early Renaissance paintings that you see in tiny towns in Umbria up in the hills. They could have you'd have no idea from the main uh, one lane road uh, going past that you'd kind of find things by Perugino, young Raphael, etc., and whatnot.
Yeah, I think I would add there that the Umbria part of Umbria is a little more on the tourist track. It's been on hovering in this position for almost 30 years as being the next Tuscany, but it never has quite got there. So yes, it's on people's tourist radar, but nowhere near in the same kind of visitor numbers as you get just, you know, a couple of kilometers away in Tuscany, which is really in its favor. But of course, the great exception to that is Assisi. So the thing about this tour that's a quite discombobulating experience is that you're gaily plunging all over the Abruzzo, never meeting another foreigner the entire time, and then suddenly you find yourself in Assisi surrounded by lots of other international visitors, and you almost are outraged, like, what are you all doing here? As if, you know, this should be somewhere that one has to oneself. So on this tour, we're staying, while we're in that part of Umbria, we're staying in Perugia. And Perugia is definitely a tourist destination for Italians on the weekends because it can get some great exhibitions in the National Gallery there, which we visit, famous for its collection of works by Perugino, young Raphael, Fra Angelico, as you just said. But then because it's only a temporary destination for Italians, at night, you get that experience of a city that, a bit like Venice, suddenly it just empties out and you're walking around Perugia and there's no other person. So it's the only place that you have to kind of deal with other people finally being around is Assisi and the Etruscan sites because every Italian school child must visit the Etruscan sites of Lazio at some point in their education. And those days, in my experience, everyone's almost outraged that there should be anyone else on the site with us.
That just reminds me of the beginning of a Fellini film where there's the uh, the school excursion and they're going up to cross the Rubicon, which I don't think of. Well, maybe you'd probably cross the Rubicon in
Pardon?
you'd probably cross the Rubicon sometime on the itinerary.
I don't know. I'm not familiar with
Yeah, yeah.
the Rubicon.
That's okay. Um, but I suppose it just reminds me, I suppose, of some of these things you're saying about there are different patterns of behavior that are very, very Italian, like that day tripping to a great cultural capital, but you're only there for the day, and it's not hugely internationalized, or the kind of you are coming into contact with people who actually live in the place and who aren't necessarily there because of its tourist infrastructure. They're not there because of tourism. They're there because and you're in touch with them because
Mm.
it's where they live. Um, you've mentioned sometimes that means that kind of say accents can be a little more difficult to understand. You're also coming into places where kind of English isn't de rigueur, unlike it is, say, in Rome, Florence, or Venice, where of course naturally everyone speaks English.
Yeah, which to me, yes, absolutely, that's true. Less so once you get to Perugia and Orvieto, because Perugia's had an international university for a long time, and Orvieto, because of its proximity, you can get to Orvieto very easily from Rome. So it is a little bit more on international visitors' radars. But in Abruzzo, absolutely, if people I personally feel that wherever you travel, it's just good manners to greet people in the local language, even if you're mangling it horribly. But those kind of courtesies are really important in Abruzzo. You would never enter into a store in Abruzzo without saying buongiorno. You would never leave without saying arrivederci. That would just be, a horrible commission of bad manners. But yes, for any kinds of interactions that you have paying in a restaurant, buying a ticket, any kind of daily interactions that people have, buying a postcard, any Italian that you can use is appreciated. People have English, but they haven't had the same kind of infrastructural advantages in how they've learned it and don't have the same call to use it as people do in the big tourist cities. So yeah, for people who are studying or have studied Italian, to me, that's actually one of the joys of the tour is having to use one's Italian. With the bus drivers, for example, the coach drivers always want to chat. And so they're just dying for someone in the group to say, like, buongiorno, come sta, so they can then have an interaction with people in the group. So to me, that's actually one of the upsides of the tour is having to use, and most Australians have some Italian in their toolkit of some description. But the thing that I think is a real kind of flexibility point on this tour is something you've already alluded to, which is hotel choices in these places are limited. They're four-star family-run hotels that we work with, and we prefer to work with family-run hotels for kind of obvious reasons. But in these places, that's what you work with because there are no chain hotels. And so in a family run hotel with no more than 20 rooms, there is never any point comparing your room to the person next to you because no two rooms are ever the same. The floors tend to be those spotlessly clean, polished tile floors. The bathrooms have those late 1980s, early 1990s shower cubicles that, really test one's ability to wash one's hair without raising one's elbows from one side. They're idiosyncratic, but the people who run them with warmth and they care actually about you. The last time we ran this tour, someone needed to go to hospital, and in the middle of the night, the owner of the hotel took them to the hospital and waited with them because I was doing something else and couldn't accompany them. So you get the best of being in regional accommodation, but you can't go in with the expectation that a regional four-star hotel remotely resembles a four-star hotel in the center of Rome. It's just not the same beast. It will never be the same beast. And if you stop and think about it for a few minutes, you'll think, I don't want it to be the same beast. I'm in the middle of nowhere. I want to be staying in a family-run hotel that operates in this kind of a way. And in the case of L'Aquila, as you know, this is the first time this tour is able to stay in L'Aquila itself because after the 2009 quake, and just do the sums on that for a moment, this earthquake happened 15 years ago and still more than that, no? 16
16, yeah.
16
Yep.
years ago. Help me with the maths. But it happened 16 years ago, and this is the first year there's a big enough four-star hotel in the center of L'Aquila for our group because of the drawn-out process of the building works that had to be done in L'Aquila. So in previous years, we've had to strategize around being able to use L'Aquila as a base, but this year, for the first time in 2026, we'll be able to stay in a family-run four-star hotel in the actual center of L'Aquila. So
Which is
yeah,
a beautiful, beautiful place to
it is.
stay.
It is,
Yeah.
isn't it? But
It is.
beautiful, but also strange. I mean, you visited L'Aquila, so you know what I mean. It is. They've rebuilt things be I mean, beautifully, the rebuilding work is so beautiful, and the replica work that they've done in some places because they couldn't rebuild using existing parts is so thoughtfully done. And last time I was there, they'd almost finished redoing the lovely central Baroque square.
Yeah.
Had was finally no longer a car park and building site combined, and was almost again a hub for the town. It's a beautiful, beautiful Baroque um, town, and courtly and elegant. But then, yeah, odd because you still will be walking along this beautiful boulevard and turn a corner and there's a giant ruin of a Baroque palace, and it makes you stop and think, my goodness, 16 years ago, this town almost ceased to exist. And everything that I see is both this combination of extraordinary geological chance and a concerted effort to rebuild and recover that town. So, L'Aquila, I'm really pleased that we're finally able to actually make it a base for the tour.
Yeah. I'm just thinking as well, like if there's um in somewhere like or in the region, there seems to be that there's a lot that is uh a very different experience from what you would have in like in particularly the large cities, which are so well, all their infrastructure is so well developed. But now I think what you're really bringing out is that kind of there's a different type of authenticity in being in seeing not just a historic city where every building has been repainted and it looks perfectly historical, that are kind of you're actually in kind of historical cities that are living and recovering in the case of L'Aquila. And that's a
Mm,
different level of, I suppose, being in touch with not
mm.
only Italy's history, but also its present. Um, does that pose any particular challenges to people?
I don't think, if you mean, does it pose any kind of physical challenges or put up any kind of physical barriers? Not as much as one would think it would. And I guess to take the earthquake as an example, the extraordinary thing about having to rebuild after an earthquake, and this is part of the reason why the process is so protracted, is that all the new buildings obviously have to be up to earthquake code, but they also have to be up to all the modern building codes that they wouldn't have before. So buildings that before were not remotely accessible now have to be if they're being rebuilt and recovered for use as for example, a hotel. Now they do have to be accessible buildings, and that's part of one of the many challenges in terms of rebuilding cities like L'Aquila, but also we should say, Assisi, because that's the other earthquake affected site. 1995 is in my brain for that one. But the other earthquake affected site that we visit on the tour, also still to some degree in a phase of recovery. So, in that sense, there's not the kind of physical barriers one might expect. We do a couple of activities on the tour that require a bit more physically from people than others. So we do, weather permitting, take a cable car, weather permitting, up to the top of Gran Sasso Mountain Peak. And the last time we ran the tour, we got up there. We couldn't take the cable car because of high winds, which from down the bottom of the mountain felt outrageous that you would suggest that there were high winds. And then we got up there with the coach, and some of the slighter people in the group had, kind of momentary thoughts that they might get blown over the edge of the mountain, because it was honestly, someone had their sunglasses blown off their face, and they cartwheeled down the great so-called Campo dell'Imperatore, field of Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, at the top of the mountain peak. And so the weather up there was amazing. So those kind of things going up Gran Sasso, people should stop and think about whether they're affected by altitude, because we don't go to the summit of the peak, but we go up to Campo Imperatore, the place where the history of it's amazing. This is where Mussolini was imprisoned by the Allies when Rome fell, and they took him up to the top of Campo Imperatore and made him live in this 1930s ski resort that he had had built up there to kickstart tourism in the Abruzzo. And then the Germans air parachuted in and took him out of the top of Campo Imperatore and took him up to the top of Italy to Salò to institute the puppet state of Salò. So there's all this history up there, which was harder to appreciate when we were being blown around the field last time we ran the tour. So altitude is something to consider, and how people manage curvy mountain roads on a coach is obviously something to consider. But the only kind of thing that requires a little bit more from people physically, which we definitely have an opt-out for, so it's just a half a day's activity, is that there is an extraordinary fortress. You had it as the introductory image for our
Yes.
session today, Rocca di Calascio, and that is a medieval fortress. If people have watched, come on, help me with the title, Nick. It's got Michelle Pfeiffer and Matthew Broderick, and she turns
Um,
into a wolf.
Lady Hawk. Not
Lady
the.
Hawk, thank you.
Yep.
She
Yep.
turns into a
Yep.
hawk, and Rutger Hauer turns into the wolf.
Yep.
Fabulous, fabulous film. Much of which was filmed in the Abruzzo. And Rocca di Calascio is the house that Rumpole of the Bailey, the guy who plays Rumpole of the Bailey, who is in Lady Hawk, he lives in this house, which is actually this medieval fortress that we visit on the tour. And we get the bus to a certain point to the abandoned village below the fortress. Then we get vans from the bus to the abandoned village, and then from the abandoned village to the fortress. It's about, I think it's a 900-meter walk, but there are quite steep sections, and it's a graded walking path, so it's not paved. So and then you quite literally clamber around the ruins of those fortresses. So there are opt-out points, and if people don't want to attempt it, in the past a couple of people have not attempted it, but in the past people who thought this is going to be a challenge for me just wore sturdy shoes and brought walking poles and did it. And you do want to do it because the view from this fortress, you see the entire Emperor's Field, you see the entire mountain pastures that run all the way up to the foot of Gran Sasso, and it is the most grand, amazing landscape. It's part of one of Italy's most popular hiking trails. And so it's well worth getting up there, but that's the only kind of thing where people, I guess, should have a think about it. That and the fact that as soon as you say mountains, people should remember that we're mostly talking about hill towns. So while we stay in Sulmona at the beginning of the tour and it's flat, and why it's in the valley, and L'Aquila is on mostly flat on top of a hill. So most of L'Aquila is in the flat. Perugia involves some up and down, and some of the excursions involve some up and down. So yeah, hill towns should be a trigger for people thinking about their kind of their knees and their lungs, I guess.
Yes. Yep. I'm just thinking that kind of maybe if when you get to the top of Rocca di Calascio, you might need your binoculars in case you can spot some sheep.
You can see sheep from the you see specks of white in the distance if the weather is kind. I mean, you're up quite high, so you need the clouds to be kind, but no, mostly it's the proportions of the landscape up there, and also remembering Rumpole of the Bailey um clambering around that fortress. I think Lady Hawk is
Yep.
required viewing for anyone who wants to visit the Abruzzo or Emilia-Romagna, the other region in which much of Lady Hawk was filmed. And it is no coincidence that I also have a tour to Emilia-Romagna. It's like Kathleen's Lady Hawk tours of Italy.
And it sounds like kind of we say it's not kind of there, like hiking, but just kind of a good level of fitness, sturdy shoes, and more of
Correct.
analog with being in a more kind of or a slightly rougher around the edges, less polished for
Yeah.
tourists than probably just having approaching a tour like this or approaching the region with the right sort of spirit or kind of
Yeah.
inquiring and just willingness to adapt and explore as necessary.
Which is what the groups have been like that we've taken on this tour. They're people who have explored Italy very thoroughly, but have not ever been to this part of it. And so it's a group of people that you feel it would be pretty hard to surprise with the wonders of Italy because they're all quite familiar with the wonders of Italy. But I'm each time I've led this tour, I'm really blown away by people's response as you go along. It's not the kind of tour where you get back to the office and think, I wonder what people will say they enjoyed in their feedback. From the sounds people are making, the oohing and ahhing that you hear, people's excited chatter about sites that you visited. You, as a tour leader, you get the sense that you are actually giving people, helping people have an experience that they wouldn't otherwise and maybe haven't otherwise had in Italy. And there's a lot of discussion about over tourism, but the thing I personally love about Italy is that you can still have those experiences. It's not that there are hordes of tourists everywhere. If you're judicious about where you go, that sense of revelation and authenticity, I know, overused word, but that is still possible.
which is fantastic and something that I kind of both enjoyed developing in our tours to Italy is kind of finding those places, knowing the history behind them, and being able to, as you've been able to show today, it's that very broad knowledge of Italy's history that allows you to be able to make an itinerary to a place that brings out kind of very, very different aspects of a history that is far more than just kind of Rome, Florence, and Venice.
Yeah, no, I love this tour. I would say that we always have a problem with hotel capacity on this tour, and we only have a limited number of available rooms left. There's one hotel in particular where the size of the hotel just really restricts the size of the tour overall. And as people who've been on our tours know, we do tend to get a lot of solo travelers in a group as well, and that means you chew through your room allocation a bit more quickly. So yeah, I guess the only thing I would say is with this tour, that it's always a good idea if you're considering it, if you're thinking about it, it would always be a good idea to get Irene in our office to hold a room for you because most years we've not been able to accommodate as many people as we would like because we've just run out of rooms.
Okay. Well, unless so if anyone else has any questions they'd like to put into the chat, we can always you can always get in touch with us later if there are any other questions you have for Kathleen. But thank you very much for having time this afternoon to talk about this region of Italy that is um, really quite extraordinary, a very, very different part of Italy to visit.
Yeah, no problems. Absolute pleasure. Always happy to talk about the joy of traveling in Italy. And I guess I would just say thank you to everyone who's come along today because this is our last session this year with one of these kind of informal chats about a tour. And we've been really gratified to see people's interest in getting to know our tour leaders and getting to know our tour program a little bit more in this kind of a format. So as you all know, when you attend one of these sessions, you get the link to the playlist with all the previous sessions this year, and we can see that people are really engaging with those. And obviously, we'll be starting up again next year, I think on the 3rd of February. I could be wrong, but anyway, if people are on our mailing list, they'll get the sessions in the information about the sessions in the new year as well. So yeah, just thanks to people for embracing this initiative, and we hope it's been a pleasant way for people to spend their Tuesday afternoons every fortnight.